important work called Essay on the Treatment of Enslaved Africans. I think if you look on Google, you might actually find it in Google Books these days. If not, we have a copy of it at the archives. In 1784, James Ramsay observed that master and slave are natural enemies to each other. Slavery, in the manner and degree that it exists in our colonies, could never have been intended as a social institution, for it supposes tyranny on one side, treachery and cunning on another. His essay was written after 15 years in St. Kitts, where he served as the Anglican minister to St. George's and Nicolatown, and he was also the surgeon for a number of plantations in the area. In other words, the planters would call him in when there was a case that required special medical attention among their enslaved. His writings, therefore, were based on the real-life observations that he made during his period in St. Kitts, and therefore they were a significant contribution to the abolitionist movement. Ramsay was actually recognizing the psychology of slave society. Lack of freedom generated hatred, resentment, and even endangered the society in which it existed. Submissiveness was relative to what the enslaved felt they could get away with. Another historian of the time, Brian Edwards, wrote, "In countries where slavery is established, the leading principles in which the government is supported is fear. Treachery and cunning are not elements of a submissive people. Fear is prevalent in slave societies. All this implies subversion. So we cannot talk about a people who were submissive to the institution in which they had been forced." The enslaved people of the Caribbean did not accept their assigned status. Rather, they resisted it and from time to time even opposed it openly. The first instance of this rebellion in both the English and the French Caribbean took place here in St. Kitts in 1639, when a group of slaves left a plantation in Capistaire, on the northern side of the island, obviously, and took refuge in the mountainous slopes of what was then called Mount Misery. They set up a community similar to the one that they had known in Africa. These people would have not been long here. The first enslaved reached here in 1626. This was only 13 years later. And from their stronghold, they raided the plantations. Obviously, Governor de Poncy, Capistaire was French at that time, did not like this, and sent his troops to bring order back into the district. They managed to subdue the majority of them, but one individual who managed to gain legendary status because he held out for so long, was able to evade the troops that came in after him, although eventually he too was captured and executed brutally, very much in a similar way to the way the Knights of St. John, whom de Poncy was one of them, used to quarter traitors in the Grand Harbor in Malta. Other rebellions during the period were planned and sometimes even attempted, but success needed long-term planning and resourcefulness. At that time, resources rather than resourcefulness, both at that time rather in short supply. The small size of St. Kitts made it difficult for maroon communities to survive indefinitely, even on the less accessible slopes of the mountains and the Southeast Peninsula. But this did not stop the enslaved from trying. A law passed in 1722 mentions specifically Johnny Congo, Christopher, and Antigua Quamina, who had armed bands in these areas. Rebellion also ended the slave period in 1834. While in the neighboring islands, the new apprentices, as they were called after emancipation, attended church services for celebration and Thanksgiving, many in St. Kitts went on strike, some even joining the runaway Marquis of the Woods and his group of rebels, and they were in the Brimstone Hill area. This was provoked by the news that the enslaved in Antigua were going to be free immediately rather than go through an apprenticeship period, and also by the rumor that Lord Romney was going to free his slaves in the same way as the Antigua planters were going to do. So there was this fear that among the enslaved that their liberty was being withheld deliberately. In the Caribbean and the rest of the Americas, enslavement meant enforced labor for life and control over the physical self of the enslaved, even during periods when they were not working. The aim of these rebellions and others that failed to materialize was to do as much damage to the enslavers for as long as possible. They knew they weren't going to succeed, but they still tried. It was a protest costly in human lives, with very little hope of success, but it was a demonstration of the frustration felt by the victims of the system. Rebel slaves were often a small minority, but they had supporters among those who remained on the estates and who provided them with intelligence and food. What was it about Caribbean society that provoked such acts of desperation? The key probably lies within the legislation of the time. Legislation governing the everyday existence of the enslaved was designed to meet the needs of the planter. It was not a democratic society at all. There was an elite group and everything centered around them. The laws of the islands started from the assumption that slavery was legal and that it was transmitted automatically through the slave mother to her children. The enslaved were treated as property to be sold and bequeathed as their owners wished. All free men were more or less vigilantes. They were expected to police the enslaved, recapture runaways, administer corporal punishment, arrest those suspected of misdemeanors, demand to see permits to leave an enslaver's property, and question strangers. Plantation society lacked accountability. The same men who passed laws saw to their execution and sat in judgment. Judges who were not of the planter class still identified with its interests. This left the enslaved vulnerable to extremes. They were not allowed to move around without authorization, congregate in large gatherings, possess weapons, sound horns, or even practice rituals that were not known to their owners. Punishment was brutal. On the leased plantations of Orton and Foy's, these included the wearing of an iron collar for persistent runaways and baths in pepper water. By far the most popular form of punishment was the flogging of both males and females. Since the lashes were regulated by law, another set was usually administered the following day. Actual and threatened attacks on elite society were met with savage punishments which were partly caused by the harshness of the European penal system and partly by the paranoia that was generated by plantation society. Keep in mind, during this time, kids in England could be hanged for stealing a loaf of bread. If that could happen to their own people, imagine what could happen to people who they considered others. An enslaved woman on the Earl of Romney plantations, the one that was in Old Road, not the one in Bird Rock, believing that the attorney of Romney had deprived her of her freedom, which the proprietor actually intended for her, she actually appealed to the governor to intervene on her behalf. On the other hand, you have James Stephen, who we've mentioned many times already, who earned a certain amount of trust, probably because of his standing in the community, from the enslaved. Stephen actually drew attention to the plight of the enslaved through his book, Delineating Slavery. And in it, he actually quotes from a plantation book for Foys and Ortons. These plantations, incidentally, belonged to Nathaniel Wells, who we just spoke about, who was born a slave but was set free by his father. Stephen noted that the enslaved on Foys and Ortons were decreasing in number because of the mortality rate. They were dying too fast. The new lessee of the plantation, Terence Comerford, was neglecting the well-being of the slaves, and their number had declined by 39% over a period of 4 years. Stephen admits being a friend of William Wells, Nathaniel's father, and he was probably using this occasion to appeal to Nathaniel to be a bit more like his father and take care of the plantations, or take a closer interest in what was going on his plantations. By the end of the 18th century, slave owners were noticing a difference in the way their enslaved workers dealt with their condition. It was not that the desire for freedom had suddenly become fashionable among the enslaved. Rather, they were beginning to realize that society was slowly changing. These changes were most obvious in the laws and court proceedings of the time. In 1783, during the French occupation of the island, the St. Kitts legislature passed an act to prevent the cutting off or depriving slaves of this island of any of their limbs. In the years 1784 to 85, 3 cases of abuse were brought to court and actually helped to generate interest in abolition in England. These were cases of mutilation against planters Jordan Burke and Wadham Strode, who were eventually fined £50 and £100 respectively, or a term of imprisonment. Then in 1786, William Herbert was accused of ill-treating a 6-year-old boy and fined 14 shillings. Kittitian society was still a long way from putting serious value on the life of a human being. However, the cases did mark a turning point in the legal practice on the island and fueled, as I said, the abolitionist movement. No longer was a slave owner free to treat his enslaved workers as he wished. This gave the enslaved expectations that they formerly did not have. In 1798, the General Assembly of the Leeward Islands passed an act for effectually to provide for the support and to extend certain regulations for the protection of slaves, to promote and then encourage their increase and generally ameliorate their condition. What was happening here was they were beginning to realize that abolition was round the corner. So they figured ways of delaying it, also ways of trying to keep a viable labor force on the plantation. Through this act, the ill-treatment of slaves became a criminal offense. It also set out in minute detail the provisions of food, clothing, medical care, and attempted to encourage monogamy and child rearing. I think they're being called now natality laws because they were directed at encouraging more births. The enslaved were still not allowed to give evidence in court, so enforcement was difficult. And there was no independent means of supervising the application of laws. In other words, there was no police force that was sympathetic to the enslaved who could actually look into all this. The change did, however, show that the enslaved were not without rights, and many of them would have done their best to find out what their entitlements were. Oral traditions hold that James Stephen played a major role in this. Enslaved Creoles learned to take advantage of the abolitionist movement. They became aware of their allies in the metropole. They also started to realize that they had some bargaining power and began using it to negotiate better terms for employment. Information on reforms picked up by the literate slaves who read newspapers, pamphlets, and by the domestic slaves who carefully listened to political conversations in the homes in which they served. The news of revolutions in France and in Saint-Domingue were extremely interesting to these people, and they were quick to spread it among their brothers and sisters on the estate. As long as slavery lasted, resistance remained a constant, although it varied depending on the circumstances and the opportunity. Creole slaves often recognized the futility of open rebellion and attempted to improve their life within the system, and therefore their resistance took different forms. After rebellion, the most obvious way of resisting enslavement was running away. Again, the circumstances, opportunities, and attachments often influenced those who contemplated this drastic move. Skilled colored and Creole slaves had a better chance of escaping. Enslaved women rarely ran away, mainly because they would have had children or other relatives that they cared for. Kinship, especially in the existence of children, often stopped them from trying. In the case of Bette Douglas, her first concern when she started this whole process was for the manumission of her two sons. Manumission means the freedom